Hey everybody, welcome back. Today we're going to talk about GDPR, um, why it's important, where it came from, what it consists of, and so on and so forth. Um, so first of all, GDPR, as an acronym, means the General Data Protection Regulation, and we'll see basically why it's so important both when you're dealing with security and when you're dealing with privacy. Um, so, um, so let's first talk about the so-called EU DPD, right? Or the Data Protection Directive. Now, the DPD is actually the predecessor of GDPR. GDPR actually inherits a lot of its a lot of what it contains from the DPD to an extent, but we'll get to that in a moment. So first of all, the DPD came into force in 1995, and it did set out three principles: transparency, legitimate purpose, and proportionality. Um, while the GDPR, which obviously replaces the DPD, um, actually became a law in 2016 and came into force in 2018. So there was a 2 year grace period. But the biggest difference between the two is that while the DPD was a directive, the GDPR is a full-blown regulation, which means that while the former does not have is not so mandatory in nature, the regulation, which is the GDPR, actually is. Um, So GDPR also introduces two very important terms. The first one is data controllers, and the second one is data processors. Now, when we talk about data controllers, you need to be thinking of data owners. These are actually the people, or this is actually the person or the organization who owns the data and who is responsible for its security. With data processors, it's a bit different. Again, we're talking about either a natural person or a legal entity, but this is actually who is working with the data, which does not exclude for the possibility for the data controller and the data processor to be the same person or the same organization. Um, Something else to keep in mind, and this is something that people at least initially are having a hard time comprehending. GDPR does not only apply to EU member states. I have two typos on this, so I apologize about that. So GDPR does not only apply to EU member states; it applies to every single organization that processes data of EU data subjects. So this is important because at least initially, a lot of people are thinking, okay, so this is some EU legislation that or regulation that I shouldn't care about if I'm on the other side of the planet. Okay. Um, and next, there are also some principles that uh, are written in the GDPR, and if you remember them, a lot of what GDPR is about is going to make a lot of sense to you. Okay. So the first one is lawful, fair, and transparent processing. Um, what does this mean? So this pretty much means that the processing of data should only happen for the purpose which was communicated to the data subject initially, right? Um, which is pretty much self-explanatory, even by the name of the principle. Next, we have the so-called purpose limitation, or the limitation of the purpose for which data was collected in the first place. This means that you should only collect data, or the purpose of data collection should always be declared upfront, right? Um, it should also always be a legitimate one, so you cannot just um, do this without a valid reason. And again, you need to have communicated or declared it beforehand. right? So once you define that, you should stick to it and not go anywhere outside of what you have initially communicated. Okay, so next we have so-called data minimization. Data minimization is about not being or not going out of line when it comes down to the purposes for which data is processed, right? So for example, let's say that let's think of a good example. Let's say that you wanted to register at a site that at a website that talks about buying a new home, for example, right? So you try to register there, but inside the registration form, you see that it's asking for your driver's license in order to register. So this is excessive. It does not, it's not needed for the purposes for which you're making the registration. So it would be a violation of this principle. Right. Next, we have accuracy. Now, some of you might be thinking, okay, but why accuracy, right? Why would I care about that? Well, there are lots of reasons. There are lots of reasons. But just to give you an example, imagine if the information about the health condition of a person is not accurate. Imagine if it has been flawed or it has some mistakes inside of it, then it could potentially lead to wrong treatment or even or even death, right? So this is why accuracy is so important. So next we have the so-called storage limitation, and storage limitation is pretty much self-explanatory, but just remember that data cannot and should not be stored forever. So there should always be a rotation schedule or rotation period for which the data is stored, and this schedule should not be violated in any way. Okay, and the last one is security. And as you know already, security and privacy are very tightly related to each other. They're not mutually exclusive in any way. You know, on the contrary, they're usually, you know, one of them is complementing the other and the other way around. And in this case, we're mostly talking about integrity and confidentiality, because as you remember, security is generally composed of the so-called CIA triad, or confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So in this case, you need to make sure that the data is protected by all means possible, so that nothing happens to it, right? It doesn't get its integrity does not get impacted, its confidentiality does not get impacted, and so on and so forth. Okay, thank you, and I'll talk to you in a bit.